All right. So we're in here. Um, I'm Shock Exchange, of course. And I'm with Mr. Mitchell, and it's Trump in the global economy, and Trump and the G. Putin invades the Ukraine. So that's been all the been dominating the 24-hour news cycle the past couple of weeks, of course. But from an economic standpoint, just generally with the economy, same old, same old. Nothing's really changed since last time we spoke. We're coming out of the pandemic. The economy hasn't fully reopened, so it's hard to look at vital signs for the economy. Retail sales have been strong, given the situation. So implies the consumer may, it could be some pent up demand, or the consumer still could just spend like they were spending prior to the pandemic, even though we thought the economy was weak. The consumer was still driving the economy, constantly spending. The retail sales were pretty strong over the Christmas holiday. Some for some companies, they were mixed. Um, um, the Federal Reserve is talking about hiking interest rates. I'm not sure it's going to have a big effect on the economy per se. They say they're trying to stem inflation, but the price gouging will continue. I'm not as far as the market is concerned. I think a bigger impact on the market would be if they actually cut liquidity to the market. I'm
Right.
not sure a 25 basis point rate hike or 50 basis point rate hike would have that big of an impact. Really, are they going to continue to support the stock market? Which implies that the reason we keep talking about the stock market and the economy at the same time because the market is the economy, apparently.
Right.
Um,
That's the sad
but
part.
um, you know, they should have done this years ago, normalized interest rates. But here we are. So that's sort of my take on the economy. It's still too early to talk about the economy's vital signs because they're so distorted because of the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was pretty interesting, and like one of those moments that you're by yourself, and you find yourself talking to yourself though, because what you're reading is so outrageous. Uh, and I found myself doing exactly that when I was reading the comments by Jerome Powell when he said, "Oh, we should have did this earlier." I'm
Right.
like, like really, you like really, you think you should have, you think the Fed should have done
Yeah,
this earlier? I think
we
I
need to do something about
paced.
inequality. Okay, you think?
I think I think I paced and was yelling around my desk for like 5 minutes.
Well, Janet Yellen said a few years ago. Janet Yellen said we're gonna maybe become a feudal society where you have a bunch of serfs, a bunch of people
Right,
ruled the
right.
serfs. Like you
Uh,
think?
yeah, it's just like to hear these same folks that are the very ones that perpetuate this very issue that we're in, and then have moments, uh, of of hindsight, moments of clarity. I guess, like, oh, I guess we should have. That's just hard to, I guess take these folks seriously because yeah, it's just really a slap in the face, honestly. And I think that's where the outrage, at least on my end, comes from. And then my people got to ask me like, "Oh, you okay?" Because looking around the office, you're here by yourself, but I don't see anybody on the phone. Like, yes, I'm yelling at
Right,
myself
right. We thought
because
you were talking to
clearly
somebody.
because clearly nobody else is listening.
Yeah, we thought you were talking to somebody. I'm walking in the street. People are like, you talking to me? Like, huh?
Yeah,
No,
right.
no, I wasn't talking.
All right, so yeah, it's to hear Jerome Powell say, um, we should have done this sooner. We should have acted faster. We thought inflation may end up at this point. Although even Deutsche, if you ignore us on the low end of the totem pole, even Deutsche at this point, even what last year, um, pretty much gave the equivalent of Chicken Little, the sky is falling. Gave a warning to the Fed, gave a warning to the entire financial industry that inflation will erode the entire economy inside out. You never, and I've talked about it even on this program, because you never hear, especially multinational banks, take a strong position in any controversial topic, especially economic. They typically straddle the fence, very middle of the road language because they have customers and they benefit from either side, whether it's an inflationary environment, whether it's a deflationary environment, whether it's a melt up, meltdown, or otherwise, they are the arbitrators of the winners and losers. So to take a strong position in either direction will often alienate one side versus the other. And now you're talking about jeopardizing potential profits, right? So to see a multinational bank take a strong position, and not just a strong position, but to give a direct warning to central banks, Federal Reserve included, was the equivalent of Chicken Little running around, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. So to even hear Jerome Powell, talk about the fact that maybe we should have done this earlier. Maybe we got it wrong. It's upsetting because you even have cohorts that jump on the same private planes, that go to the same Davos summits, that go to the same G8, G20, and every other G series and closed door meetings with you, and are telling you the same thing, and it was ignored to the point where they had to put it in a paper. They had to release it to Reuters and release it to Bloomberg because you folks weren't listening to them in those closed door meetings. It's disingenuous, it's outrageous, and frankly, to me, heads should roll. But you know, who's gonna live? If you aren't willing to listen to Deutsche behind the closed doors, then who am I, right? Who are the other 390 million folks that are not a part of the 1% that have influence over policy the same way. So yeah, and I think that just really rolls into the Russia conversation because we have the luxury of not being in the middle of it, right?
Mm.
It doesn't disrupt your ability to go to the grocery store. You still pump gas at the gas station. Pick your kids up from school. So it's a moment in time that's a part of the news cycle. I think for most of the American public, um, is not having a felt or tangible impact in a way that folks are connecting the dots between a conflict in Europe and the way of life in America. Um, so, we have the luxury of being able to, talk about it, right, and analyze it and go into these deep dives. But obviously, the first thing that kind of comes to mind is even the fact that the U.S. has committed, I think it was something like 350 million to Ukraine and in the defense of Ukraine. Um, and the first thing that I typically think about, especially when expenditures are going out, because these are tax dollars. Where was the vote? Where was the not just the congressional vote, but the vote by the people? All right, that your tax dollars are being expended. Meanwhile, you're still dealing with a high inflation environment at home. Right, uh, things are a mess here. Um, what are the amount of dollars that are being committed to folks here? We just heard a State of the Union address that addressed many different groups, um, from sexuality to gender to educational groups and otherwise, and yet one particular group was ignored again, and that group was black folks, and the only addressing that black folks got was that, um, we're going to continue to fund police departments for safer communities. So, and this on the very cusp of the fact that, just today, officer was cleared of any charges in the reckless endangerment regarding the Breonna Taylor case, who still has not gotten justice because of no knock warrants. So these are the same folks that, the president just 48 hours prior stood before the American people and told them that, yeah, we're going to continue funding the same mechanism that caused the death of Breonna Taylor, that caused her boyfriend, who did what he needed to do as a man to protect his home, protect his loved ones, the very same thing that, this country claims is core to the Constitution, is the right to bear arms, the right to protect one's home, the right to protect it against invaders, and being woken up to doors being knocked down, shots being fired into your home, and you're returning fire in the protection of your home, and yet he still had to face trial. He was still presumed guilty and had to fight for his innocence. So these are, in relation, like, what does that have to do with Russia? What does that have to do with Ukraine? And to me, it has very much to do with the fact that these are the issues that our community is facing on a daily basis, versus, countries that are thousands of miles away, um, that are still practicing anti-black uh, anti-black policies in the midst of war. Right? You're asking us to care. You're using black people's tax dollars. Like, let's be very clear. And that goes back to why I said, well, was there a vote? Because the question is, would you like to use a percentage of your tax dollars to support a country who, in the midst of war, has time to practice anti-black policies uh, to keep black people from crossing borders, to keep them confined, and to continue to show and be proud of the racism, because that is institutional racism. When you're practicing racism through policy, that is institutional racism. So they have time in the midst of the crying and the suffering and the bombs and the guns and the invasion. You still got time to be reminded that, wait a minute, although these people are at our border, they murdered some folks, they've already dropped bombs on some buildings, but you black. So you got time to remind
Right, right.
folks. So I'm wondering, what polls did the CBC take
So some of the
about should
commentary.
we use tax dollars to be supporting these same folks that practice anti-blackness in a whole other country?
So some of the commentary, some of the commentators, the newscasters abroad, they were saying that, oh, these are people with blonde hair and blue eyes. They're being bombed. They're
Yep.
being displaced.
But this is
This is
Europe. This
yeah,
isn't
this is Europe.
Syria. This
Right, this
isn't
is Europe. This isn't
Afghanistan.
some third world country. So like they were basically saying it's almost okay because it's a problem because it's people who are dying and being displaced are people with blonde hair and blue eyes. That's not supposed to happen to them, and people being displaced or being bombed in Europe, not third world countries. So while Obama was bombing black people or African countries, he was in office. Or, nobody said a word, even though people knew what was going on. And so the same thing as that Putin is being criticized for, Obama won Nobel Peace Prize for. And so
And that's the gag
nobody
of
was
it
saying
all.
right, nobody was saying a word when Obama was dropping bombs. So they know who to. In some ways, there may have been race distancing policies from Obama's perspective that it's going to show white Americans or white men who run the country that how
And what?
non how non how non pro black he really is. That he's not pro
Right.
black, and so I'm one of you guys. So look what I can do to show that I'm not pro black.
No, that's absolutely right. One of the interesting things I think that has come out of this as well is that when you look back, early 80s, 80, 81, um, that uh, you had about 5,000, roughly 5,000 or so no knock warrants issued nationwide. As of 2010, and that number jumped to over 60,000 no knock warrants annually. And if we recall, who is the
So
the
fifty five
administration in
thousand.
office
So fifty
in
five thousand more
2010?
black people. So 55,000 more black people experience no knock
And
warrants.
right, this is the very so is like what does that have to do with what does that have to do with Russia? Is because our tax dollars are being used to fund policies domestically that black people, by and large, have been at the tail end of that consequence. And as opposed to using those tax dollars to either reallocate to creating safer neighborhoods by way of even what Camden's model has done extremely well of community policing, because that's really the core of the defund police message. You have to, at this point, let me just call it what it is. You have to be a blatant idiot if you think defund police means getting rid of all police. Um, yeah, you just have to be stupid at this point, just blatantly obtuse to truly believe that black people don't want their communities safe, that they don't want their communities policed at all. The difference is that we want safer policing. And that safer policing looks like uh, community policing, where police are held accountable by the very communities that they're in, that large percentage of those that are policing within communities come from that same community, that there are community boards that also get a hand in the outcomes of judicial, like extrajudicial killings of police officer has to use their firearm, and their firearm results in the murder, the death of a suspect. That you have people that are on those police boards, because there is a community board that ultimately reviews these police cases, that qualified immunity is completely eliminated. That if you have the responsibility of using a firearm, you have the responsibility of policing a community, then you also have an obligation to that community, that you have to stand before that community and be held accountable to said community. That's what defunding the police is about. And that's what it looks like. And Camden has followed that model, and the results are phenomenal. The even the amount of crime, the amount of drugs that has been in one of the most drug-ridden, high crime areas over the last 30 years dropped 60% in a single year because of community policing methods. That new officers, even potential new hires, literally have to go door to door and canvass the neighborhood to introduce themselves to every community member as a potential new officer, and to hear the concerns of that community, so that there are better bridges built between the folks that are policing the community and the community itself. So you are taking dollars, in other words, from these same communities that constantly get fingers pointed, criticized, etc., and you're sending it overseas to communities who have time to have the same objectives, the same perspective as police here, that are anti-black, that get to practice racialized policies that black people suffer from, and you send the same tax dollars overseas to folks who are practicing the exact same anti-black attitudes and racialized policies. Um, so to me, that is the thing that black folks should be concerned about,
Mm,
frankly.
okay.
When it
Okay.
comes to should I care about Russia? Should I care about the Ukraine? How does this impact our communities? Does it even impact our communities? And I think that's where the concern and the focus and the advocacy should be, because to me that's a misuse of
Mhm.
resources.
Right.
And frankly, the politicians that voted for that misuse should be held accountable by the community that voted them in.
Right, but I don't think anybody I think it's one of the many issues, but nobody really cares what black people think before they make a decision as far as
Right,
allocating funds. The
right,
only good use is non doesn't benefit black folks directly. Seems to be,
right,
but gasoline prices are higher. I think that affects everybody. They could
right.
remain high. They
But
could
that
remain
was
high as long as we're in, as long as there's this war going on in the Ukraine. Um, and excuse me. So I think it's the gas again. Oil prices are above $100 a barrel. Gas prices are high. It reminds me of the Iraq War now, back in the late '80s. Not Iraq, but well, I guess it was
Desert Storm,
Desert Storm back in the late '80s, early '90s.
early
The gas
'90s.
price was
Yeah,
like $10 a gallon.
yep,
I remember like I was working at a bank and there was a customer who had just opened a gas station. The worst time.
yeah.
The worst
I
time.
mean,
And again,
I think one, the question, because one, our dependency on Russia specifically, um, as a oil partner is relatively low. Because of the oil fields throughout the Caribbean, Grenada, Trinidad, um, as well as the oil fields. I think what the largest one is in Texas that was discovered. I think what like 7 years ago, something like that. So it's reduced the dependency. So we were seeing higher gas prices even before Russia, right? So I don't suspect that it will have significantly higher impact specifically because of the Russia-Ukraine
I would say
conflict.
higher,
Now,
higher than it would have been, higher than it would have been otherwise. I don't know why the gas
yeah,
prices were going up to begin with. It's just more
I,
price gouging. That's all I
I
can
was
think
gonna
of.
say, I think what we're seeing more so because the goal of the U.S. even under the Obama administration was energy independence, right? To be completely free of reliance, certainly on OPEC, and the stronger the country will be, the more independent it is, right? So um, that I think that continues to be a goal, but there is definitely some price gouging. I think that
Right,
can speak for why we're seeing as
right.
if the goal has not been deterred of having independence in the energy sector, period. Outside of some of uh, the the trading partner ripple effect, because although we have little independence or little dependence on Russia, but it also impacts other U.S. trading partners, Germany
Of course,
being
because
one of the
Europe is
largest one, right?
dependent
So,
on
right, like
oil.
Europe, so you're gonna have some ripple effect because that's still a U.S. trading partner, but I don't think it speaks to the percentage increase that
Right, right.
we've seen just across the board. So I think
Understood.
that begins to point the finger elsewhere, and that finger, I think, price gouging is
I mean, the
the
oil, right? So U.S. oil companies, at least the shale oil companies, can't make money if oil goes below a certain amount, certain price, whether it's $40, $35, what have you. They can't
right.
make money. So It used to be that when I was younger, that high oil prices were a bad thing. Because basically
Right.
everybody has to buy oil, everybody has to buy gas. Now, high oil prices is a good thing because now the oil companies can make money. So you basically sort of taxing the rest of the country for the benefit of one industry. So
Exactly.
and so they're trying to so high oil prices is a good thing because it keeps people employed in the oil industry, but
Right.
it costs everybody equally. But okay, so Russia basically has entered the Ukraine, and about 500,000 people have been displaced. It's probably even more now as we speak. And some say it's the largest war since in Europe since World War II, which is sort of a big deal. Putin said that Ukraine belongs to Russia, and I tend to agree with him. I mean, when the Soviet Union broke up in the late 1990s, it broke up into 15 different countries or what have you. I always looked at Ukraine as those former members of the Soviet Union. I always looked at them as part of Russia. That when my impression was that Russia was the Soviet Union was having economic problems, so they decided to break apart because they were struggling financially, economically. But if the Russia wanted those jurisdictions back, they would take them back whenever they felt like it. And so I think part of the agreement, from my understanding, that these countries were not to join NATO. That was part of the agreement
Right.
under Gorbachev, from what I understand. So that's pretty clear. And
Hmm.
people have short memories. That some of us were children back then. Some people may not even been alive. And so now you
Right.
have at least some of the countries that were under Russia's jurisdiction, but not officially part of the Soviet Union. So like Poland, the former the Czech Republic, Hungary, have become more westernized. They have joined NATO, and they're not communists anymore. So they have become more
Right.
westernized, and they are members of NATO. So the former Soviet Union have lost those areas. And I think Putin has asked for the NATO to leave those areas that I
Hmm.
would call the former Soviet sphere of influence, and NATO said no. NATO dug in their heels. So what's left is really the Ukraine, um, Georgia, Belarus that are on Russia's border. And I don't think
Right.
Russia wants. I definitely know Russia does not want NATO on its borders. So that being said, when I think Ukraine had talked about joining NATO, had made overtures about joining NATO, which again they were told not to. And I think in 2013 they were about to join NATO, and then the pro-Russian person in charge said no. So
Yeah.
he decided against it, and then the people turned on him, and then I think he got overthrown. That was 2013. 2014, Russia invades Crimea and annexes Crimea. I think they have a naval base there. So it's not a big it's not a you can definitely see the connection that as Ukraine started making more overtures about joining NATO, now Russia's getting more aggressive about annexing Crimea or parts of the Ukraine.
Ukraine.
I don't think it's a big. I don't think it's a big surprise that now they're invading the Ukraine. They do not want the Ukraine as part of NATO. They do not want these Western forces on its border. And just a matter of time before they just basically take back the Ukraine, take back Georgia and Belarus. Um, to me, it's just a matter of time. And I think you're going to hear more chirping um, from Putin. Maybe he's serious about NATO leaving those former spheres of influence, Poland,
Mm.
Hungary, um, uh, the Czech Republic, and he can maybe use that as an excuse to start to maintain a Cold War. We want you out of these areas. This is our this is our areas. This is the former Soviet Union. This is our influence. If you don't leave, it could create some sort of long, elongated Cold War between Western countries, parts of Europe, and Russia and China. So that's sort of
Well,
that's
some.
sort of the big my sort of bigger picture. But I've always assumed those countries were always going to be part of Russia when they wanted them back.
Right. Right. Some. Some would say that the Cold War never really ended, right? That it just simply transitioned. And I think that there's a case to be made for that. I mean, even if you're not 100% certain on, or even just kind of sold on the fact that that war has continued to rage on, if for no other reason that, especially from a U.S. lens and a Western lens, that the military industrial complex is just that. It is an industrial complex. And what is outside of that almost kind of losing some of its meaning? Like, what does an industrial complex need? Well, it needs capital. It needs. So we pump huge amounts of capital into the military industrial complex, and you have to justify, well, why does this thing need so much capital? Why is it such a capital suck that it is? Well, you got to point this thing in some direction. And when you begin to kind of follow the money trail of the Cold War, and frankly, any other war, I think one of the turning points that I recall in more recent years, in terms of, um, I think the American public really tying a direct line between the incentivization of warmongering, and going to war itself, like beyond the propaganda, was Fallujah. So during both Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom, so OIF and OEF, as a result of 9/11, like the 9/11
Mm.
attacks, and sending Marines into both Afghanistan and Iraq, and the heavy battles that took place during Fallujah and the heavy losses that took place during Fallujah. And you had a president who still sat on the board of Halliburton, while actively being a president. And it was, the whole debacle, and you're listening to Colin Powell, you're listening um, to Rumsfeld and Cheney continue to defend this weapons of mass destruction. Meanwhile, Marines and soldiers um, were finding piles of gold, not weapons of mass destruction. And it was very clear. There was a clear line drawn between the sacrifice, the lives lost, and the real intention beyond this patriotic rhetoric that continues to get spewed out. And when we, could draw a direct line between the share prices of Halliburton and the Iraqi war, so to speak. The so when we look at, in other words, going back to the military-industrial complex, and really, has the Cold War ever ended? If for nothing else, having an objective to continue justifying why we're spending, 10 times the next closest nation on the militarization. uh, there has to be a point to it all, right? There has to be a justification congressionally, legislatively, and there's no broader two words than, or I should say terms, really: national security and the Patriot Act. It's like those two terms unlock funds like nobody's business. I
Right.
mean, we can really say that, certainly for the first 10 years of the war in Afghanistan, and really the first 6 years of Iraq, that was, if you were Blackwater, if you were a contractor, you were a DoD contractor, that was your Timothy Geithner and Hank Paulson moment. That was your too big to fail moment.
Right. Right.
That was your Fed pumping $80 to $100 billion a month into the market to keep markets up. Like that was your time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in other words, even if you don't have enough information to say, well, whether the Cold War never ended, if for nothing else, when you follow the money, to me, it makes a very strong argument that no, the Cold War has never ended. It simply transitioned from one type of war to another type of war. But all in all, in the interest of national security, our favorite phrase to unlock the
Yeah, and
the,
keep America safe. Keep America safe.
exactly
That's a big.
the
That's a
war
big.
chest.
That's a big. I guess a big grade. Personally, gets a big grade for looking tough and keeping America great, or
E-
acting tough and keeping America great.
Exactly. So, I would that is my point that I argue that I don't think the Cold War has ever really ended. Um, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after Ceausescu out of Romania, and overthrowing dictatorships. The whole idea was that this represents a new era. This represents democracy, yada yada yada. It's like, but democracy is simply, oh, we get to now pump government contracts
Mm, mm,
and get other folks to pay for it. So did in the interest, if you are Russia, if you are Ukraine, if you are Latvia, if you are Croatia, if you are Czech Republic, a Crimea, any of these countries, and you're looking at it from your side of the lens. In other words, um, I would certainly think that for them, no, it never ended. You're seeing us as a money bag, right?
mm.
You're seeing us as a grab, and unfortunately, most of these folks are just kind of stuck in the middle because, like the West, it is not the majority of citizens that are partaking, that are reaping the benefits of any warmongering. You're simply caught in the middle. Um, it's the
Right, right.
oligarchs, and for us, it's the one percenters in the West. But they play very similar role in playing politics and playing policies that impact the rest of the country. And for the most part, I'm sure most of the folks that are even escaping Ukraine, trying to get out of Ukraine, they just want a roof over their heads, opportunities for themselves, their children to be able to live a stable life, and just kind of keep to themselves, right? So yeah, I think that um, this Cold War has never really ended. We've simply found new ways to continue to fund war as an industry
Well,
and
when
war
I
mongering and
when I think
yeah.
Cold War, I think I mean, I know that the U.S. and Russia have still been spending a lot of money militarily. I think China has been able to escape a lot of the wars. They've been able to escape, grow their economy and expand geographically, expand their sphere of influence, whether it's Africa or South America, without going to war, with spending money and buying up resources and saying we'll help
For a
you do
hundred
this, we'll help you do
years,
that,
man.
right? And so, when I think Cold War, I'm thinking like countries that are sort of similar in
Yeah,
power. So
right, right.
I think this is kind of, I wouldn't say the first time, but maybe one of setting up to be a situation where you have the U.S. at odds with another superpower, like
Oh yeah, I think that's
not just economically, but in
right,
terms
right,
of
right.
like geographically, we want this region, and Russia says we want it, and Russia has emotional ties to some of these areas because they used to be, again, part of Russia's Soviet Union's former sphere of influence. And so when you had this cold, if you have a cold war between Russia, maybe there's no trading between less trading between the U.S. and Russia, less trading between the U.S. and China. 'Cause I think China's setting up to sort of back Russia. because it
That's the
has
way
because
it definitely
because they're
seems
close.
with that.
They're close geographically. They're
Right.
close geographically. Russia has a lot of oil, so they have something that China may potentially want. Um, and then they also have like the U.S. is less dependent on Russian oil, where Europe is. So
Now it's
and
interesting that you bring up of China because I think we've been watching that transition, and even well, one historically, China and Russia I think have had closer ties than I think what most folks realize. Like even
they're
the
closer in
kind of the
geography too, though. So it's better.
right, they obviously
That
share.
works.
Right, right. They share they share borders and ethnic groups of people
Exactly.
as well. But politically, monetarily, as well, and militarily, they are they are a lot closer in the sense that even like this battle, the kind of the headlines of the battle for Africa, right? That Russia had a presence in Ethiopia and Djibouti dating all the way back to the late 1800s. They were actually one of the first military partners uh, in Africa after uh, the Berlin Conference of 1864 and 1865, where European countries essentially carved out Africa and agreed to colonize, between the Spanish and the French and the Portuguese, et cetera, et cetera. China was one of the first countries that actually was the first partner of a newly liberated Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah from 1959. They were the first. It was the first trade partnership that Kwame Nkrumah signed with Mao. So, in other words, these are just examples of how China and Russia have had kind of similar perspectives, executions in terms of geopolitical opportunities, and have kind of seemed more eye to eye than adversarial. They have been adversarial in the past on certain issues, but I say all of that to say, even in more recent examples was Syria, where uh, Turkey's I always chop up his name, and I'm going to do it again. Erdogan, the president of Turkey, and we saw that between Syria and Turkey, that there was this disdain for the U.S. In fact, I believe Turkey even booted one of the U.S. ambassadors back home, like sending them back home, and they opened up discussions and dialogue to both China and Russia. And I thought that was an interesting turning point because at that time, I think that uh, folks were just tired of the U.S., frankly. I think
Well,
folks were tired of.
they see through the U.S. They see through the
Yeah,
U.S.
right,
and
right. That there's
and
only yeah,
Putin
and that
Putin
they.
basically said, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say that. Um, so I really see China's alignment, because China is always behind the scenes. They get credited for being the soft power, right? So they're always negotiating, and when you're always negotiating, that often means that you're often the middle man, right? So you're saying one thing to one folks, you're saying another thing to another set of folks, and always seeking to be the most benefit or to be the most beneficial um, entity in those go-between relationships, right? So
Hmm.
we're clear that this is not an altruistic
Well,
relationship that China and Russia shares, but yeah, it's
they have a
pretty. I think
common
it's a
enemy.
continuation, right?
They have a common
And
enemy,
that common enemy being the U.S. and
right. They all
and
have
to,
the same agenda. They go about it differently. Russia is. Putin basically saying that you're not what you did to Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi is not going to happen to me.
right, pretty
It's
much.
not
Yep.
happening. The same thing that Kim Jong Il was saying. Kim Jong Un,
Correct.
I guess Kim Jong Un was saying, what you did to Saddam not gonna happen to me.
Right.
And they've had these sort of discussions when it comes to Iran. So for the U.S. always has a way of finding ways to invade countries that has natural resources. So
Of course.
you found a way to invade Iraq. They so happen to have a lot of oil over there, and
Right.
now you're talking about having some type of conflict with Iran, and Russia saying no, you're not
No,
going to do
right.
to Iran what you did to Iraq, and we're gonna see to that.
Exactly. No, it's
We're gonna see to that, and so Russia can't. I mean, Putin can't give Iran or other countries any solace that we can ward off the U.S. if they can't ward off the U.S. in their own backyard. So they have to show some type of have to Ukraine has to be a show of strength to Belarus and Georgia that you're next. And it has to be a signal to maybe some of those other places that form a sphere of influence that we're serious about getting NATO out of these areas, out of Hungary or Poland or what have you. And then and then secondly, they excuse me, China also has a similar agenda as Russia. They want Taiwan, so they can get if they can back Russia in the fight for Ukraine. Maybe Russia will back them in their fight to get back Taiwan. They also want those disputed waters, the Jaiwu Islands. It has a bunch of rare earth minerals underneath the water and a bunch of minerals and natural resources that the U.S., Taiwan, U.S., Japan, China all want because they have natural resources and rare earth minerals there. So those disputed waters are important. It's going to be a battlefield for China and also for Taiwan. And Taiwan's going to be a battlefield. So they back Russia, then maybe but Russia back them in terms of trying to get back um, areas that they consider their sphere of influence as well. So I think that's what it's setting. That's how things are setting up, and it's pretty clear that Russia's not going to back down, and I think they're gonna continue to chirp about these other areas that they want NATO out of. And you have
mm,
the United States that doesn't necessarily need Russia's oil. They're not close to Russia geographically, but Europe is. So
right, and it's one of the things I found interesting about the China Russia relationship is that and this is obviously just my speculation. I have zero evidence otherwise in my own observation, but
has that ever stopped you
it,
in the past?
exactly. Well, I like to throw out the disclaimer, right? Like, yeah, this is just my 2 cents. But uh, the parallel that I see, and it's an interesting parallel of China and Russia, is similar to the parallel between Germany and Japan. Um, that you really have, at that time you had two nations, relatively small nations, especially compared to their neighbors, and certainly um, to the countries that they ultimately were seeking to colonize through imperialism, and damn near won. They were one war from us. We either would be speaking German right now or or Japanese right now. Maybe not even had this podcast either, right? But point being is that ironically, Russia was, obviously landmass still one of the largest nations on the planet. Same way with China, and then to be, just beaten. Just like Jesus, when you look at the amount of losses between not even just World War II, but World War One as well, the efficiency, the military efficiency um, uh, of Germany in both, especially in World War One, and World War Two was, a sight to behold. That you know the, the casualties that they were able to limit their losses to, the strategies that they were able to implement, and I think Russia's strategy was just, keep throwing bodies at it. So now the roles in terms of size, capacity, and strength have flipped, right? That you have these two countries that were under the thumb. Well, China was definitely under the thumb of Japan, where Japan is what, the size of Rhode Island, and China is the size of four U.S.'s combined, and you have this tiny island colonize. Colonize this huge landmass, and it was just it's just kind of mind blowing just from the sizes, and now the roles have reversed, right? China has been able to stay out of wars, but have continued to benefit from economic wars, have continued to benefit from imperialistic tactics. One being, the disputed waters um, with the Philippines, with Taiwan, as you alluded to earlier. So with their Asian neighbors and counterparts, and now Russia is kind of taking a playbook, because I don't think that the sphere of influence, if Putin had his way, would simply be relegated to the reunification of the USSR. I think that we would be looking at very much, Germany, World War II ambitions, in terms of imperializing the half of the globe, right? And I think in that way that both China, because it's interesting that China has largely remained quiet when it comes to openly picking a side. However, when you look at the partnerships by way of arms, by way of even opening up backdoor discussions, by being the facilitators, they're kind of showing you who they are aligning with. And the reality of to me, a China Russia partnership would be leaps and bounds more consequential than a Germany Japan partnership. Um, yeah, it's China hasn't been in a physical war
Right, right, right.
in 100 years. U.S., we just came out of a 20-year war that cost us trillions of dollars, and nothing to show, literally nothing to show for it. Absolutely nothing to show for it. You still have you still have a Taliban. Taliban is literally partying on IG, two-stepping to Drake. Like, I'm not even being facetious. Not even, they partying it up. Why?
Right.
Because uh, you've spent all of this money, you spent all of this time, all of the bodies that we have thrown at this war, and we've racked up a debt of over $30 trillion. We have rising corporate debt. You have student loan debt and auto loan debt that are as high and will soon be surpassing mortgage debt. You have credit card debt that is choke holding households. You have foreclosures that are on the brink of being some of the highest foreclosure, like surpassing '07 to '09, which
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah.
only the second housing
But the oil
crisis.
industry and military industrial complex are happy, right?
That goes to the point, right? That in other words, you have the difference between a World War II American economy and if you want to call it a World War III American economy, is that the American economy is sicker than it was off of World War II, where you're coming off of the Roaring Twenties and almost in a very cyclical fashion, right? Roaring Twenties was followed by the Great Depression, and equally, if you look at 2000 to 2010, It's kind of the equivalent of the Roaring Twenties, right? And
Oh
you
yeah,
had,
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
look,
Now
you had,
yeah,
you're
you got
coming
the
off
Federal
of
Reserve just like yeah,
well,
Ben
that's what
Bernanke's guys
created
just
the housing crisis, right? You literally had people buying 10 and 12 homes with no income. You had everybody and their grandmama was flipping because the economy was just being boosted and boosted and boosted. Yet people were ignoring the long term consequences as to what was happening with this inflated bubble, same way as the Roaring Twenties.
yeah,
And what was it
we know
followed
what happened.
by?
But we have history. We have history to show
Right. I'm just saying,
how
like,
this is
look at
going.
these
I understand.
parallels, right? Like,
Right. I
it's
understand.
pretty
I understand.
interesting that we're following these parallels, but unlike, like, the biggest difference between, well, what was the result of the Great Depression was we had a New Deal, right? And these and Americans' favorite term, socialism. Well, folks, the New Deal was socialism. Like, I hate
The
to
New
break it
Deal
to
was
you.
the New Deal went to the investor class pretty much.
Well, not only went to the investor class, but it definitely opened up the door to, hey, this is where we saw an actual middle class. We saw 2 decades of the 40s, well, really 3 decades, 40s, 50s, and the 60s, right? You saw a middle class, you saw a rise of employment, labor laws, unified a minimum wage. You had an actual 9 to 5 or 40-hour work week. You had FHA loans uh, opening up the door to education, to housing, to the auto industry. So you saw this real, and to me, this is what gives the the trickle down argument some substance because yes, the investor class definitely benefited the most, but there were there was definitely a trickle down that was felt across the country, even from black people, the that was the fastest and largest rise of the black middle class and employment within the black community. You had over 600,000 jobs, I believe, in a 10 or 15-year period that were government jobs that
Mm-hmm.
black people were employed by. So the New Deal had this roaring, and I would argue not just trickle down, like that was a waterfall down, in other
Mm-hmm.
words. But the difference between World War II America is that A, we had the New Deal, and today is that we've never had a New Deal. And that's
Right.
the
Okay.
issue, is that
Yeah.
we had a worse, the the period of the year of the pandemic led to deeper levels that surpass. And when you look at unemployment, when you look at income, um, when you look at the rising prices of goods and services, that year was worse than 4 years of the Great Depression.
Mm.
So, and yet to have that impact and to not have New Deal type policies come out of that has caused a greater sickness economically within the country. So we are
Right.
in an even worse position today that we are not in any sort of position to go to war with anybody at this point. You
Right.
know,
Right. But the point I'm trying to make is that okay, let's paint a scenario for you, right? So there's the
Mhm.
Cold War is still sort of some sort of a war in terms of could be some sort of a mini economic war. But the U.S. has already tipped its hand. You can't get aggressive with Russia when they say we're gonna take over the Ukraine. And what are you gonna do when they say they're gonna take over Belarus or
Right,
Georgia or we want the Czech Republic back? And
right,
then what are you gonna do when China said we want Taiwan back? You gonna
right, right,
have
right.
sanctions? You gonna hit them with sanctions?
Right.
What do they do when they
Good
start
luck.
putting ships in it? When they put ships in the Daewoo Islands?
China has their own central bank. They have their own development bank. And for folks that don't know, the AAIB, is China for years has been trying to be a part of uh, the IMF and the World Bank system, and the central bank system, and Europe and the U.S. has continued, and including the Pacific, has continued to keep China out of essentially the equivalent of Exim banks, banks
So
that loan
maybe that's
for
a carrot.
infrastructure and commercial. And China said, okay, no problem. So they started their own.
Mm.
And and it's three times the size of,
So
of the US and Europe's combined
right.
development bank.
So everybody's been kind of doing this money printing stuff, right? And just
Right.
attacking the economy. Europe, U.S., and China. I'm not so sure about Russia, but again, I mean, the U.S. You can't. I mean, we're gonna look kind of weak if when China said we want Taiwan back,
Right. I mean,
and when
there's
not
literally
if but when,
nothing.
not if but when they said they want
Right. And
Taiwan
not
back.
when they've been saying it. They've
Right.
been
Well, not just
saying
say it, but
it.
like be a little more aggressive about it, because
Right.
now you can't hit them with sanctions and hit China, hit Russia with sanctions when they you can't be aggressive on Ukraine and then not be aggressive on all these, because now you're gonna have all these countries contracting. That's not good for the economy
Exactly.
when you don't have global trade. It's not good for the economy, and so the U.S. is at the precipice, and now we're gonna have all these countries pulling back, and so it could almost be like, who's the weakest? Who cannot afford an economic war or a trade war, or
The
what have you? Who's the weakest? Is it China? Is it Europe? Is it the U.S.? This is the scenario that Reagan had during the '80s with Russia. We're gonna spin, spin, spin. Whose economy breaks first? So,
right.
I mean,
And
Can China afford to really have global trade pull back? They have their own problems.
right.
So,
And that's one of the issues. You can kind of look at both Reagan and Trump. Trump's approach to manufacturing. Where Reagan deregulated the environment. That was a core tenet of Reaganomics, right? Is deregulation environment. Well, that deregulation opened up the door for outsourcing and essentially eroding the the independence that really allowed America to build a surplus. That was the other impact that came out of World War II. Right, manufacturing boomed. Right, it
mm,
caused a surplus. This is how we got Social Security. Social Security
right.
had a surplus for the first 30 years, which is why you could depend on Social Security because of that economic boom through manufacturing. We fast forward, Nixon begins to take us off of the fiat. That whole argument of the gold standard jumps into the conversation. No matter which side you sit on, the thing that you can't ignore is eroding a regulatory environment that was not only meant to provide safety infrastructure around manufacturing, because we lived in a time where there was a boom of manufacturing without any safety, and that was called the Industrial Revolution. And, and literally hundreds of thousands of people have died as a result of building railroads,
Mm,
skyscrapers, et cetera. Essentially, the infrastructure of the country, right? So, into regulation. So, we had to erode the very regulatory framework that was meant to prevent what happened in the 40 years of the Industrial Revolution. And it opened up the door for, frankly, more greed, in the sense that, well, great competition, income competition has opened up the door. So, yeah, I can send jobs over to Mexico. I can send jobs over to India. I can send jobs over to third world countries, where now my capital is going to get used more efficiently, in the sense that I get to keep more of it between between the difference of the sale price and the cost of goods price. And then fast forwarding over to Trump, uh, kind of touting, yes, we need to bring manufacturing back. We need to, even Obama echoed that same sentiment that we need to bring manufacturing back. There was some, attempts policy wise under both administrations that largely fell flat on his face. Um, and just resulted in the continued erosion of manufacturing and erosion of independence. We went from being a largely independent country to a largely country of consumption and convenience, which means that the factories are elsewhere. So there's no
Right.
way that you can have the investor class continue to be at war with China while you stand on a pulpit as a president, as congressional leaders, and balk at your manufacturer and distributor and
Oh,
say,
okay.
well,
Right, right, right,
you can't take over this country. Really? Who's going to stop us?
right,
Because
right.
even the people in your own backyard are going to be telling you that we absolutely can. So it ends up just being toothless rhetoric.
Right.
At the end of the day, China can do whatever the hell they want to do, when they want to do
Especially,
it, how they want to do it.
especially when
Uh,
these oligarchs has assets over in China.
exactly. Like
a,
that's
a
how a lot of
manufacturing,
the
as a
oligarchs
manufacturing, a
have been
manufacturing
able
plants
to.
over it in China. But I
Right.
mean, while the Ukraine may not have that bigger impact on the U.S., but these sanctions, I mean, this you're gonna sanction Russia, it's not gonna be an equal and opposite reaction. You
Right.
understand? It's not gonna have. It's not gonna. The pullback in global trade is gonna have an impact someplace. Someplace. Now, what happens when Russia pulls back? So if we're gonna wall off the rest of the world, we're gonna deal with do as much business with China as we possibly can, or vice versa.
Right.
At some point, a cold war with a more chilling relationship with China when they try to take Taiwan, or more friction with Russia over time, it's going to have an impact on the United States. It's going to have an impact on our economy when we're most vulnerable. At some point, it's going to have an
Right.
impact because I see that it's not going to stop. It's not going to stop. Where
Right.
people where they have these emotional reactions to, we want our territories back, it's a form of sphere of influence, and it's an emotional thing. It's a visceral thing. It's not going away with either Russia or China, and they have global trade pull back as raising interest rates and pulling back on liquidity or quantitative easing. It's going to have an impact at some
Yep.
point. That's how I see it. So, but that's basically. I think it's more like Crimea could be like, excuse me, the Ukraine could be sort of the canary in the coal mine that Putin's not going to stop,
Yeah.
and China's gonna is gonna amp up their ambitions. So
Yeah. No.
one last parting shot on Putin
Yeah. I
and
think. Yeah. I'll just end my parting shot on the relationship between China and Russia was interesting. Is that as I think other countries, especially outside of the West, don't view have this same antagonistic view of China as certainly the U.S. has. We've been kind of socialized to view China as these like evil communist devils, so to speak. Whereas those outside of the U.S. and certainly the U.S. Propaganda sphere don't see China as a threat in the same way. And I think the reason that that's important is that what's interesting is that although China, I think in a lot of ways, has this view outside of the U.S. as a partner, right? A partner to developing countries, um, commercially, economically, um, and that these are uh, kind of, I guess, friendly relationships, right? That although these are largely kind of friendly relationships, that China within their own borders still has a strong hand. They believe in they certainly believe in bending the knee under the umbrella of the CCP, under the umbrella of the party. That yes, the people make up the party, but it is the party that sets the guidelines. And Taiwan is an example of that. That even the Philippines is an example of that. Although it's their waters, it's literally the Philippines waterway. But in spite of the antagonistic relationship and frankly dogmatic relationship that China has had with the Philippines, we watched the Filipino president Duterte reject the U.S. out of the Philippines and turn to China as the major trading partner, as their major economic partner, in spite of China's straight up threat that has prevented Filipino sailors and fishermen from fishing in their very own waters. So, in other words, outside of these friendly relationships, you see this almost dichotomy of the difference between the way that they handle domestic policy versus international policy. So, on an international level, it could seem like Russia is acting in a way that conflicts with even China's international approach or foreign policy approach. But it's actually in line
Yeah,
with the
yeah,
way that China handles their domestic policy. So I don't
right.
think China views Russia's attempt, whether it's Crimea, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Czech Republic, at recapturing these lands. I think that that is one of the things that they actually have in common. And it would be interesting to see, I guess some sort of public breakaway. But the with between the two of them, because otherwise, China, both China and Russia less so than China, has created kind of this insulated economic world, right? Where, in spite of sanctions, U.S. is giving Russia sanctions for years, and yet you continue to see these Russian oligarchs' wealth continue to grow, right? Even the Panama Papers evidenced that, and this is in the midst of sanctions. So it's like with sanctions, if they're still growing economically with
At least
sanctions,
somebody's growing
and
economically.
right,
We
and
know
if
like
China,
15, 20 people are growing economically.
there you go, right? That might be the case.
We haven't
But
talked to the rest of we haven't talked to the rest of the Russians, but we know 20, 20, 25
exactly,
people. Yeah.
exactly. Um, and if China is clearly still growing, even with these tariffs and the threat of both a physical and certainly economic war, and they continue to just kind of brush it off, even with the fact that China will black bag one of their citizens and kidnap them in a hot second if you have violated domestic policy, according to the Chinese Communist Party. And the U.S., Canada has threatened with sanctions as a result of these type of Gestapo tactics. And China, like, what has happened to China? They only grow, right? So it's, I think what's really happening, what we're watching in real time, is kind of this insulated alliance that's being built. And the U.S. is almost grasping at straws to try to prevent a Germany Japan type alliance, right? Because if if China and Russia decided to partner and to go full scale, I'm not sure that there would be too many countries, the U.S. included, that would be in a position economically, domestically, to prevent such an outcome. And because we're in such a precarious position economically, without ending up like Venezuela or Zimbabwe with hyperinflation, right?
Right.
Like, can you just print another $100 trillion? Sure, you can. You can absolutely do that. But what will the cost of bread be? Do I need to print off $1,000 bill or maybe a $10,000 bill in order for me to buy my bread next week
Right.
and my milk and to put gas in the car because we're trying to uh, stop a Germany Japan type alliance from happening. So yeah, I think I think for me that's the biggest observation out of this Russia Ukraine conflict is seeing China's position and seeing how China and Russia are growing a bit more closely, and then the fact that again we're using tax dollars that black people are contributing to send over to anti-black countries that have time
Right.
to practice anti-black policies and racist policies in the midst of their suffering.
Right. Right. Okay. So thank you for that. So, but yeah, I think this is just a commercial for what's to come. And I think as the time goes on, we're going to be less in a position economically to issue sanctions against anybody. And only people who's strong enough to even fend for the United States would be probably Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and some black women as part of those investment
Oh my
programs.
God, you ain't just you
Well,
ain't
no, I
just
mean,
say
no, I mean, like,
that.
I'm just saying, like, so let's send Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, since they have
Oh
favorite
my
status,
God.
since they have favorite status in this country. Let's send Wall Street, some hedge fund managers. Let's send Citadel over there.
It's the same people that wrote black womenomics that they're going to be the black
I
women
didn't.
brigade generals.
I didn't. That's not. That's not what I said. That's not what I said. I said
They're going to
specifically. I
say,
said you're putting words in my mouth. But I'm just saying. I'm just saying. The ones who got favorite status, let them go over there. And those are gonna be the only ones economically strong enough to
that's true.
to fend for the country. Because I think as time goes on, we're getting weaker economically, and we're not gonna be able to issue sanctions against anybody. So I think it's almost like having a strong reaction to Russia entering the Ukraine may have been a mistake. Because now if you don't have the same equally strong reaction when they enter um
Yeah,
Belarus or Georgia or whatever.
yeah.
When they want Poland back,
Listen,
and
the U.S. at this.
how long can we get NATO to continue to support us? Because we're pushing
Correct.
because we after Iraq, I mean, I think we burned a lot of bridges with NATO forces. So I think it's a commercial for what's to come, and we're not going to be in a position economically as time goes by to stand up to Russia or China who are making these emotional sort of visceral decisions that they're going to do anyway, regardless of the economic impact. So that's Trump and the G. Putin invades Russia. So thanks for listening. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Like, yeah.